Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish and Ukrainian Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. In recognition of Ukraine's efforts to repel the Russian invasion, today's episode will continue our mini-series exploring Ukrainian literature and literary relations between Poland and Ukraine. Serhiy Zhadan's name appears frequently in speculation about candidates for this year's Nobel Prize in Literature. He has 2 collections of poems and 3 prose works translated into English thus far, which you can find in the bibliography on the introductory page for this episode on the Polish Cultural Institute New York's website, linked in the description down below. He has developed an international reputation, touring with his band, Jadon and the Dogs, and spending time in Vienna and New York. But since the invasion that began on February 24th, 2022, he and his bandmates have returned to Ukraine, and he has been mainly in Kharkiv, distributing supplies and humanitarian aid, raising funds through his internet presence to purchase cars for those efforts, and lifting spirits around the country with his poetry readings and musical performances. In episode 15 of Encounters with Polish Literature, we talked about the idea that a poet should have a rock band, of course, and played a brief excerpt of Yuri Andruchowicz performing with the Polish band Karbito, and mentioned Polish writer Andrzej Stasiuk's performances with the Ukrainian band Hajdamaki. But I think Zhadan's work reveals an earlier connection to this phenomenon of the rock poet in the work of Polish poet Marcin Świetlicki, who performs with his band Świetliki, or Fireflies, and whose poetry Zhadan has translated into Ukrainian. In turn, poet Jacek Podsiadło has translated some of Zhadan's poems into Polish in a collection called Drohobycz, alluding to Zhadan's affinity for the work of Bruno Schulz, whom we discussed back in episode 5 of Encounters with Polish Literature. Świetlicki and Podsiadło both published in the underground journal Brulion as part of the generation influenced by the American poets of the New York School like Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery, who had been translated in a special issue of the journal Literatura na świecie, or World Literature, edited by Piotr Zomer in 1986. These poets, sometimes called the barbarians, rebelled against the neoclassicism of poets better known in the American canon of Polish poetry like Czesław Miłosz and Adam Zagajewski. And to understand the panorama of Polish poetry in the 20th and 21st centuries, we should probably know a bit more about this O'Harist current, and maybe we'll get there obliquely through their Ukrainian resonances. Before we meet today's guests, whose translations we've already encountered in our discussion of Andruchowicz, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following along with Encounters with Polish Literature. If you like what you hear on the program, click the thumbs up down below. Ring the bell to get notifications about new episodes. Follow the playlist of all of our episodes in the description of the program. Leave a comment if you can, and please click the subscribe button to show the Polish Cultural Institute New York that you are interested and would like to hear more about Polish literature, its past and present, here on Encounters with Polish Literature. Also, be sure to hang on and watch the credits at the end for some recommendations about where you can donate to support humanitarian aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war. John Hennessy is the author of 2 poetry collections, Coney Island Pilgrims and Bridge and Tunnel, and his poems appear in many anthologies and journals, including The Believer, Best American Poetry, Harvard Review, The Huffington Post, Jacket, The New Republic, Poetry, The Poetry Review in the UK, Poetry at Sangha in India, and Poetry Ireland Review. Hennessy is the poetry editor of The Common and teaches at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Ostap Kin, co-translated with Vitaly Chernetsky, Yuri Andruchowicz's Songs for a Dead Rooster, a collection of selected poems, which we looked at in our episode on Andruchowicz back in April of 2022. And he was my classmate in Yiddish several years ago at YIVO in New York. Together, Ostap and John translated A New Orthography, selected poems by Serhiy Zhadan, finalist for the PEN Award for Poetry and Translation in 2021, and co-winner of the 2021 Derek Walcott Prize. They also translated the anthology Babyn Yar, Ukrainian Poets Respond, forthcoming from Harvard Library of Ukrainian Literature from Harvard University Press. And they've begun another collection of Andruchowicz's work coming out not too far off in the future. John and Ostap, thanks for joining us to discuss your translations of Serhiy Zhadan today.
Thank you, David. It's great.
Thanks for having us, David.
It's great to have you here. So why don't we start by, saying a few words just about Zhadan's biography. Who is he? How do you describe him? As a poet, what is his position in Ukraine in the context of the history of poetry in a brief way?
Serhiy is originally from the city of Starobilsk, which is in Luhansk region. And when he finished high school, he enrolled into a university in Kharkiv, where he studied Ukrainian language and literature. And after he graduated from the university, he right away was admitted into a PhD program where he defended a dissertation on this heady Ukrainian futurist poet Mikhail Semenko, who was one of three probably greatest influences on Serhiy poetry. And Serhiy started publishing his own work pretty early. So his first collections appeared in mid-90s, and these were poetry collections. And at first he was writing predominantly poetry, plus some, he also contributed essays, some book reviews to various journals and newspapers. And beginning in the early 2000s, Serhiy switched to writing prose as well, and I should say here fiction. And he belongs to those cohort of authors who did not betray poetry for prose, and he kept writing both, and he's doing so until nowadays. Serhiy himself, who used to say that his corpus of works can be divided into two periods. The one ends in 2014, basically when the war starts, and the second is actually from 2014 and up till nowadays. So clearly, Serhiy's work in pre-2014, written in the period prior to 2014, is very different to what he is writing right now, thematically first and foremost, but also stylistically and formally. But still, especially stylistically and formally, he still sort of you still sort of can see this thread that weaves together all his poetry collections. And this thread could be hidden in this burgeoning Ukrainian literary tradition of 1920s and 1930s, a period, a peak of Ukrainian modernism, a period of great experimentation in Ukrainian letters, and a period which produced a great number of great authors, and which were vitally important for Serhiy, and who influenced his work.
Zhadan talks about his travels to America. I mean, how important is that in his imagination, John?
In the second paragraph of the introduction that Zhadan wrote for this book, he says, "For me, America fit into a poetry anthology published back in the Soviet times, in which, in addition to the classics, long dead, long safe, Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti were included. That is, having a little bit of imagination, you could have imagined a country where Whitman, Frost, Lowell, and O'Hara, there you go, lived for 100 years." I think that he is being very frank about that and not overstating the case for an American readership. But certainly after seeing what Vitaly Chernitsky had to say about Andrukovich's influences, and we know that Andrukovich remains an influence on Zhadan, and maybe it works both ways there. I think what you say, especially about O'Hara, is interesting in this context. I want to go back to the discussion that you two had earlier about Zhadan's division of his career into two parts right now, right? The pre-war and 2014 when Russia invades. And at the same time that this is true, he also says, and I like this complexity, this two things at once, if not more. He also says that he writes one continuous text, not dividing prose from poetry either, okay? And Ostap, you recognize the through line, okay? There are others too, but so I want to know, does that hold also with the prose?
I think you can really see it in prose as well, but just to showcase what John mentioned about Serhiy's division of his work, one of very interesting examples is his collection of, let's call them short stories, called Big Mac, which is unavailable in English translation right now, but which is available in Polish translation. And it came out, if I'm not mistaken, in very early 2000s or like mid 2000s, and it came out simultaneously with another collection of poetry he wrote. And both of these works appeared or were written, to be more precise, while Serhiy was based in Vienna. So he worked on those texts there, and you clearly see how that setting influences his work, his characters, his style, and also this is his first fiction work, so to say. But why I'm saying this, that a few years after the two came out separately as a collection of prose and as a collection of poetry, so there was a second edition, but now it appeared as a single volume, and his poetry is situated in the middle of those short stories. And this is something like, just to highlight that how it's not only that his poetry sort of, you see this thread that goes through his poetry, or this thread that goes through his prose. It is this thread that goes through both his poetry and prose.
Does he see himself as kind of a chronicler, or is he writing the epic of the war, or how do you read that connection between the texts?
He is a chronicler, I would say, but not in this like traditional sense of a chronicler we have in our mind, but he is very observant. He is interested in people. He is interested in cities. He is interested in having those things and those people mentioned, and he is interested in having them be remembered as they are. So it's very like this poetry is also at times it reminds me some kind of a journalism, right, where you attentively collect facts and work around facts. And so I would say that this is being observant and being interested in what is around him is one of these most interesting things that he is doing.
He is a bit of a documentarian, right? When in the poetry, is that what you're getting at? He organizes these three collections that are excerpted in a new orthography. At least he has arranged as he would a diary. He says, okay, so they're in a kind of chronological order of composition, but when he's done with a collection, he still removes removes poems and adds poems. So it's not strictly a diary or a documentary of what he has observed.
Is
there's
the
art to it? Yeah.
Is the sequencing of the poems in the translation his sequencing, or is it yours?
It goes in reverse chronological order by book. Okay. Ostap, you can speak to this better than I can. And then we have kept the order that in which they appeared within each volume in the three sections of this book.
Why don't you go ahead and read that part 4 of we've been talking about war for 3 years.
Okay, and that at some point I would like to talk about this, the fact that he is not a confessional poet, and because Ostap just illustrated it well, and David, you're also aware of this too, that his focus is external. He's been away for 2 years. She hesitated. Change the lock or not? Will he come back or not? In the end, she didn't change the lock. Probably she unconsciously expected him to come back. He would return and she would tell him everything about her take on him, about her take on all of this. She would definitely tell him. And about her terminated pregnancy, which he knew nothing about these past 2 years. And when he came back, without keys actually, he lost them somewhere, she wouldn't say anything, and neither would he. In general, they decided to talk less, especially about politics. Talking about politics in our situation is the same as talking about death in a TB ward. Someone there definitely won't like it. And here, no matter what you say, everything is politics. Bread on the table, politics. The school around the corner, politics. The early spring that fills the sky with sweet smoke, also politics. Politics in gestures, politics in breathing, politics in vocal cords that need rest. They got into a fight on the 3rd day, a fight over the shower. In the morning, he collects his stuff again. She watches the sky like milk that is about to simmer. It's too late for us to learn joy and consolation. It's too late to fix the floodgates when so much water has passed through. Life is like a house where a person is found hanging. It's too late to choose the right words. It's too late to install a new lock.
This is, definitely the chronicling mode, right? I mean, this is
Right.
scenes from everyday life in a household of somebody, affected by the war. And maybe, like where he says it's too late to choose the right words. This is where, the problem for the poet comes in, right? I mean, is where do what does the poet do? What's the poet's purpose? That's I think something that he's struggling with in all of these. Yeah.
Yes. Also, this woman is kind of every woman. The speaker, the friend of the speaker of the first one that I read, is also an every man, an every person. Because no doubt many people have friends who have come home from the war. No doubt many people have loved ones who have left to go fight, and come back changed and quiet. It's funny that we don't, in these poems at least, we don't hear too much about the specific place. Okay, we don't. We've mentioned Frank O'Hara twice already. In O'Hara or others, not that there's anyone like him, but others that come after him. Let's say we might hear of a specific corner that is being named, a specific building, this specific concert hall, right? Lots of specific singers, actors, etc. In these poems, we don't get that. We get a city, a river, a bird flying over it. Okay, so that's interesting. I wonder if you two have anything to say about that. And I, while I have the mic, I'll also say this: we don't learn anything about the poet in these poems. These are not confessional in the least. I don't know if Zhadan has children. I don't know if he has a partner. Okay. Isn't that interesting that we've learned these intimate details of these two people in the poem I just read? But we read the whole book, the three collections, and we don't learn that about him.
In general, I would like us to think a little bit about this idea of this particular cycle or cycles Serhiy, as a poet, creates, and the necessity of these cycles and what do they do. So what would have been different if these poems were, let's say, situated on their own, right? But because they can all live independently, they don't have to be sort of put together into this cycle. But what this cycle does, it sort of like creates this larger canvas, right? Something that helps us to introduce new characters and new actions or new themes. And other things I wanted to mention is that this is actually not the first time in his post 2014 work when Serhiy uses a cycle as a way to present a larger theme. For example, he is another cycle that is very well known, is called Why I Don't Use Social Media, and it was written around 2014, 2015. So more or less right away after the war started, right? And it was a first effort, I would say, to sort of chronicle this war as I would say something epic, right? And this second cycle, we've been talking about war for 3 years, is to some extent a continuation of that one.
It's something that puts us, kind of in the middle of things, that doesn't seem to quite have an end. That that we're going to see these constant scenes of traumatized people. I think that everyone is of these poems, or at least certainly the two that you've read, are like scenes of a trauma that happened, and that there's some underlying silence. Or overriding silence, maybe we should say, that's going to cover that up, and that it's projecting some very long period of recovery, I think, from that. Would you like to look at maybe how he starts or how you've decided that the collection should start with this poem, "To Get Together and Talk," because that maybe, I think, gives us an idea as to something more about the poet's objective, like what the poet can do in wartime. Why do we need poets in wartime?
To get together and talk. Let's start with what's most difficult. Let's start with the madness of getting used to the night uncoiling across the sheets. The river, like a dress lifted over your head, still remembers the warmth, still replies to the heart beating closer to morning, when the poetics of exhaustion realigned. Here we are, shouted into the night, faded like ceramics under the sun, with a language like bird squawk, with voices like animals calling to each other when fire encircles them. People from breathless borderlands get together. Butchers whose bloody fingers have stiffened as though covered with ink get together. Eternal drovers bearing the Easter spirit of the slaughterhouse get together. Books that smell of grass and milk, icons printed on the same press as futurist manifestos. The animals smell the sweet language of dawn. They study the orthography of June fogs, hiding their killers. Let's start our march across a green emptiness, the motherland in twilight. Let's drive the sacrificial cattle through the wheat choir tuning up. Let's start, all of us who saw how the quail of souls hide in a field, who stepped into the water to dispel its ice-cold anxiety with a sunburn. Let's start with what's most difficult, with singing and quenching the fires emerging from the night. Let's start by whispering the names. Let's weave together the vocabulary of death. To stand and talk about the night. Stand and listen to the voices of shepherds in the fog, incanting over every single lost soul.
It has certainly that question of like, what can the poet do? It has we're bringing in all of this imagery that's kind of part of Zhadan's catalog. We have the river, we have the bird squawk, the sky, we have the death and rebirth, and the eternal drovers bearing the Easter spirit of the slaughterhouse get together. The butcher and the printer overlapping, the ink and the blood. The orthography, which is interesting to see the term orthography, because it's the Ukrainian pravopis is like the calque of the Greek orthography, but we're returning to orthography in English, straight writing. It's a lot there. The water. One thing that I was thinking about was some of these. I kind of I sort of wonder. Like one word jumps out at me, and the one that jumped out at me here was how the quail of souls hide in the field. and the word you have for, that's originally quail, and I don't consider Ukrainian isn't a language I would put on my resume, put it that way. I mean, I can sort of figure out some things from Ukrainian, by triangulating between Russian and Polish, badly, but so I looked up Waldschneppi, which are woodcocks, if my dictionary serves me well, which become quail, and quail has two meanings in English, of course, which is which is very resonant with the poem, right? I mean, it brings out this idea of fear and so forth, and then it also has the meaning of the bird, and I don't how do you make that decision? How did you I'm kind of interested in how you work together, how you work with Zhadan as translators on these problematic, questionable spots of tension.
I don't quite remember the time when John and I sort of set up working, or actually when we had the idea of working together. I think it was probably sometime around 2018, around that time, because prior to that I already translated some of Serhiy's poems into English, and I was thinking about working on a collection, and yes, and I that's how I asked John if he wanted to cooperate on a book of poems. And when John and I were working, when we still did not know what is going to end up in the collection, I think one time we picked something from those texts which were written prior to 2014, and it did not quite worked out. And at the same time, it was a moment when this idea crystallized that we should focus on his wartime poetry exclusively, so that this will be the poetry written after the war started. And this is what I think we came up with, and were in touch with Serhiy, who was very cooperative and sort of gave us all freedom possible. And the selection we have in this book is the one we came up with. Of course, he authorized it in the end, but these were the poems we selected out of those collections available at that time. And one of the collections we were translating from, Список кораблів, catalog of ships. At the time when we were working on that collection, it was still a book in progress in Ukrainian. And basically a new orthography came out more or less simultaneously when catalog of ships appeared in Ukrainian.
And was he sending you revisions of the poems as you were working on them, or and how, like, was he, does he have enough English to, I know he knows some English to to respond to the translations, or does he just give you a free hand? Or, how has that been?
The latter. So basically, he translates from English. He translated the poetry by Charles Bukowski, which I think appeared in the late 2000s. which is what is interesting is it appeared together with his translations of Marcin Świetlicki, which tells us a lot. And he also recently he was working on the poems by Derek Walcott. So he works in or with English, but he did not as I said, like we had this freedom of working on his poems.
And John, how did the two of you work together, and how did you become involved in, become interested in Polish and Ukrainian poetry?
With Zhadan in particular, I started reading Miłosz when I was a teenager, for example. So that's been there for as long as I can remember. But and a real special fondness for Eastern European poetry in translation, starting as a teenager. What happened with this book, though, is that I'm the poetry editor for a magazine called The Common, and Ostap sent me some of his translations of Zhadan's work. It was 2015, I think, right? That was when it was published. In any case, okay. And I liked these translations very much, and I said, but I would like to make some edits. And Ostap said, well, you're an editor, by all means do, right? And that's not something that I would say to every poet. I'm probably more likely to say, I can't take this poem than to say, I'll take this poem if you do this or that, okay? Because I feel like that's overstepping my bounds. Now, of course, if I know the poet and I have something simple to suggest, if I don't know the poet, I'll do it. Anyway, so Ostap was very comfortable with making changes to these translations, and I ended up asking for more. Okay, so we did have that history, Ostap, going back to 3 years prior to even beginning a new orthography. Okay, so that's how. And then in 2018, Ostap was asked to do a book of Zhadan's poetry by Lost Horse Press, their contemporary Ukrainian poetry series. Is that correct, Ostap?
Yes, by that time I already did a volume in cooperation with Vitaly Chernetsky, and it was a volume of selected poems by Yuri Andruchovich, and they were looking for other Ukrainian poets to appear in their series.
We did the book pretty quickly, and what our process is that Ostap writes a crib sheet, and then we argue over every single word. No, actually, we get along very well. I was visiting my mother in New Jersey during the time that we were working on this book, and of course I had to work. So she overheard us working on our translation, and I came downstairs later, and she said, "Oh, you and Ostap, you work together so nicely." And I felt like she was saying, "You play together." That like Ostap is always welcome here because you play together so nicely. But it can be tedious, right? No doubt, because you identify the word quail. Well, that works. That's a happy accident in English, right? The use of the word quail there. And imagine if we had stuck with woodcock. Now that's an unhappy accident in English, right? So we go over these poems line by line, word by word, argue about them. Then I read them back in English, and we argue again. We go, and then we're done. And then I say to Ostap, "Remember, I had that problem with that particular word or that line break," and we go back, and then. Sometimes I come up with a suggestion that I think is spectacular, and Ostap is like, no, the language doesn't bend that far, right?
That's a good way of describing it, that that there's always this well, I guess that's another question is like, as a poet yourself, as a productive poet and editor, like, how do you decide when to give way as the other poet, to the other, because that there's got to be, you got to think, oh, this would be so great in English if this image were here, but sometimes it's not there.
That's absolutely right. That's exactly right. I guess check your ego at the door. The fact that there are two of us doing it, right? Ostap, I was looking earlier at this self-interview that we did with us and with Serhiy, and one of the questions was, how is translating different from composing your own poems? Well, my experience of translating Zhadan is that I do it with Ostap, and he's always there to answer questions, to reassure, to challenge. It's fantastic. And that is not the case when you're writing your own work, and you both know this.
Why don't we look at another poem where he does like deal with this theme of being the wartime poet. Would you like to read the Great Poets of Sad Times, the poem that starts with that line?
It is, as many other poems in this collection, it is untitled. The Great Poets of Sad Times. Anxious witnesses to the end of print, whose voices address the facts behind their survival in empty auditoriums, who teach their craft only to the black thrushes perched outside lecture hall windows. Brave poet of floodgates on European rivers, poet of a country paralyzed by winter, talk about hope. Those who don't read you will talk about fear and hopelessness. Talk about hope. Talk about the strong character of teachers and hunters. Your lines are long and entangled like the Danube on the European map. Talk about the perseverance of pines rooting themselves in the sand like Russian words in Ukrainian. The poetics of your continent grow from singing and grapes. Talk about grapes, about the golden continuity of vines that knit together, borders that look like the seams of a new overcoat. Talk about women singing on the steep riverbank. People from the church and city hall will tell you there are no opportunities. The endless qualities of a language, its mysterious structure, to coax hope through our bodies like fish to a black bank, to guide the perfect word through the heart like a hiker in the woods. Language is breathing filled with sense. Language is a phantom chance to to persuade at least one person not to jump from a bridge into the Seine. A poet stands in the middle of an empty city, screams at the birds flying to North Africa for winter. I don't believe in God, but that's not scary because he doesn't exist. Readers don't believe in me. That isn't scary. They don't exist either. And since the birds don't listen, the poet starts counting them in their celestial fall flocks. He counts diligently, records every swallow in his notebook. Whatever number flew away, that many should return. Each one should be counted, not a single one forgotten. Real poetry always sticks to precision.
More return of those birds and the rivers and the bridges. I get the sense from your own poetry, John, that you're a birder. Am I right?
Yeah, I'm kind of a retired birder at the moment.
Well, when you were in practice, did you ever try to count swallows? That seems like an exercise in futility, right? I mean, that's maybe the point.
That's absolutely right. I can't even count the bluebirds that sometimes hang out in the tree in front of my apartment. Yeah, that's the interesting stuff I've got there now. Thank you, David, for asking that. Appreciate it. Yeah, no, I do love the birds. And it's something that resonates with Zhadan's work. Do you know, I meant to say this earlier. Ostap, you asked me today about Zhadan as an eco-poet. And the first poem of the book is very much an eco poem, don't you think? And I think there's an argument to be made for that. I'm saying this in reference to the birds because he's paying acute attention to birds. He's paying acute attention to water and to various forest animals
and the landscape. There's a lot of
landscaping. Yeah.
One thing I really want to add really briefly is that in general, the way Serhiy treats nature in his poems, especially when you look back at his older stuff, and even the stuff he writes now, it's very much urban poetry. You know, it's about cities, it's about industrial parts of those neighborhoods. It's about cafes, it's about, I don't know, some buildings, libraries, city center. And you really think of him as this poet, like 19th century flaneur worshipping the city like Baudelaire did. And then all of a sudden, at the same time, you know, concurrently, you have this poet with a very special relationship with nature, right? And you have all of these strange birds, voices, sounds, rivers, and these metaphors, which are an imagery built on nature. And this is another aspect of how complicated, of how unexpected his poetry might be.
I mean, the opening image of the birds there, where he's talking about poets of sad times, speaking in empty auditoriums only to the black thrushes. I'm compressing there. It's like St. Francis, preaching to the birds, and then being reminded at the end that the birds aren't necessarily paying attention. That it's which maybe in the story of St. Francis isn't the case, but that's all. But that's I think that's part of Zhadan's mood, is that there's this kind of spiritual impulse, and then there's the letdown that happens later, that it doesn't measure up to the intentions of the beginning.
He says it's easier for birds, and because they don't have to worry about having a soul, right?
You have in the very first stanza, you have a poet, or probably poets, in these empty auditoriums, poets as outsiders, poets as losers, maybe even, with the only audience they have are birds outside, and it's even unclear if the birds are listening to them either or interested in them. So, and this is this sort of quite pessimistic take, maybe very sharp. I think that's something he might have, I don't want to say inherited, but something might be that the poetry by Marcin Świetlicki he translated could have been a source, or one of the sources, or because you sort of you see some parallels in the poetry of those two,
in their pessimism, that's something that a lot of the sort of post 1968 poetry of that whole group is there's a lot of pessimism there, and one Polish writer who's interacted a lot with Andruchowicz, Andrzej Stasiuk, is all about it's almost a philosophy of pessimism in some of his writing. Would you like to look at another one of these poems we're thinking about discussing, which was the one that starts out Sunday School?
Sunday School. The schoolyard leads to a riverbank. A priest is fighting with the workers who repair the road. The blooming of irises, a high sky over the riverbed. The children look at illustrations. The school textbooks note what's most important. The dead leave their coffins like it's the subway's last stop. Jesus is on the cross like a traffic cop at an intersection. No one gets what he really wants.
So is this the critique or the vindication of religion? Is it, it's sort of, it's the mundanity of the catechism, it seems like, right? I mean, that it's
it's both, isn't it? Yeah. Wow.
Sometimes when you read not only earlier stuff by Serhiy, but things that he wrote relatively recently, you think that it was most likely written by some kind of an atheist, but in fact, it seems like religion is a very important theme for Serhiy, and it is presented in this in a way that really pushes you to think and rethink certain images and situations we encounter in the pages of his books.
The interesting contrast to me in this one is between, Jesus as the traffic cop versus this moment of his characterization of nature, right? The blooming of irises, the high sky over the riverbed, that's the sort of sublime vision. In contrast, it's like, being, you imagine the, kid sitting in Sunday school and looking out the window. And maybe there he's finding the spiritual more outside the window than he is, with the resurrection as the last stop on the subway is.
In this poem, here's another kind of idiomatic use of the word to get. Okay, and I actually had to ask Ostap again in retrospect, because I couldn't remember what if we wanted that double meaning, that double entendre of no one understands what he really wants is what Zhadan says, but do we want this? No one gets what one wants, and that kind of I don't know, Ostap, how do you like having that that second nuance there?
I like it because it gives a sense of a suspense, so to say,
right,
and something that it depends on one's mood, which way to take, which way to go, and this is one of these solutions when you have this double meaning. And it works very well in this context.
But it's not a double meaning that's there. That it's
right,
in a sense, that it's
right.
It's you have to decide there, right? Is that does Zhadan like it or not? And you don't know.
Yeah. See, on the other hand, our work with Andrukovich, we would know, okay, because he has overseen the poems that we've finished so far, and he gives us comments back in English, and although again, also with him, he's very generous and has made it clear that he won't argue with us. He's not going to insist, but he's very helpful.
Let's look at the last poem. I thought it would be the last poem in the collection, which is one of the earliest poems in the collection since we're in reverse chronological order. But this is one where the original is a more formal poem. It's rhymed. There's a sort of more uniform metrical scheme, whereas the translation is in free verse. Would you like to read it in Ukrainian first, Ostap, and then John can read it in English?
So now I am going to read what is the third part of the poem called Tamplieri, Knights Templar, and this is the poem from the collection Tamplieri from 2016. So part 3. Ще по зимі лежать померлі в озерах. Ще в кожному поцілунку може ховатись хвороба, а вони вже шліфують камені по кар'єрах. І озивається порожньо кам'яна утроба. Ще уста після голоду такі солоні, хтось і далі залишається у полоні. А вони тягнуть каміння до міста, волочуть пісками, відбудовують вулиці збитими в кров руками. Тешуть каміння, тешуть, змінюють краєвиди, ламають повітря, переінакшують світло. Роблять цей світ таким, щоб його можна було любити, щоб в ньому було не так безнадійно й підло. всім, хто лишився жити після тяжкого мору, всім, хто зберіг свою радість і непокору, кожному, хто вцілів під важкими зірками, вони відбудовують місто збитими в кров руками. Муровані ними стіни, віконні рами, зведене рештування, міцні канати. Сонце стоїть над мулярами й каменярами. Ще стільки часу, щоб все це порятувати.
Would you like to read it in English?
After the end of winter, the dead still lie in lakes. In every kiss, a disease may hide itself. They already grind stones in quarries, and a stony womb echoes like an emptiness. The lips after hunger are still so salty, someone still remains a captive, but they drag stones through the sand to a city, rebuild the streets with their hands worn to blood. They hew stones, change landscapes, break air, make different light, rebuild this world so it can be loved, so you won't feel this hopeless and ashamed in it. All who lived through the brutal moraine, all who held on to joy and disobedience, everyone who has survived under the heavy stars, they rebuild a city with their hands worn to blood. They build the walls and window frames, erect scaffolding, secure firm ropes. The sun stands above bricklayers and stonemasons. So much time left to save it all.
Even though it's temporarily early, it's a good note to end the collection on. It's an image of rebuilding, of
Right?
hope for the future, which I think is very much Zhadan's what he seems to be doing. I mean, he said you were quoting from his earlier poems about or mentioning why I don't do social media, and now he's very much does social media, and it's very much about, like, I've been following him on Facebook, about seeing his role as giving people hope. Every post he makes, he ends, we're one day closer to our victory. That it's all very sort of positive about the way that he's been delivering supplies to the front lines and to the people, humanitarian aid to people who are rebuilding. Delivering medical supplies, especially, that he's been doing fundraising. He says he has various ways that you can contribute on his Facebook page, and people who are interested can check that out. And if he writes in Ukrainian, but you can use Google Translate, or you can use the translate function in Facebook to read his posts, contribute to his Patreon. He says all the money that goes to his Patreon goes to humanitarian efforts.
Like, he is very active. He is remarkably active, and when you follow him on his Facebook now and prior to and earlier, you will be mesmerized by the way this one person can do, and so many different things, So it's really very it's really very inspiring, and what he has been doing lately. And you mentioned all of the things, David. He does lots of humanitarian efforts. Helping civilians in the city, helping the armed forces of Ukraine based in Kharkiv vicinity. Actually, on the eve of this invasion, he was actually touring with his band, and they were playing, and I think they were like between cities, going from one city to another. And on the 24th of February, all of them returned to Kharkiv. And it was a very powerful and inspiring in many senses.
Yes. On that note, maybe you could say a few words about some of your other projects in Ukrainian literature and translation that you're working on.
One of the projects John and I worked together was an anthology of Ukrainian poetry about the tragedy of Baban Yar. And Baban Yar is a site in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, where 34,000 Jews were murdered in September of 1941. And the idea of that, the idea of this anthology is to present a trajectory and to showcase the way Ukrainian and Ukrainian Jewish, Ukrainian Soviet, and Ukrainian post-Soviet poets wrote about this event, and the way it was sometimes censored, and the way how also stylistically, formally, they approached this topic. John and I finished our translation a while ago, and now it's going to be published, hopefully by the end of this year, by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute.
Are these all poems from Ukrainian or from other languages as well?
In this anthology, I wanted to focus exclusively on poems written in Ukrainian, because you can find a lot of poems written about the Baban Yar tragedy in Russian. And you can find a lot of poems written about the Baban Yar tragedy in Yiddish. But for me, it was important to see how this horrific event became a part of Ukrainian literature, and how it was approached, and how it was described and portrayed despite various limitations that could have happened in the course of late 20th century.
Okay, John, did you want to talk about your Andruchovich project together?
Sure. There's not a whole lot to say yet about it, except that we're focused on his early period, 80s and 90s, poems exclusively from that period. We are maybe 25% of the way through, and as I said to you before the show started, David, as soon as we started sending them out shortly before February 24th, and they've met with a great reception. Okay, there's some irony, I was saying, and you may cut this, you may keep it. Okay, there's some irony, I was saying to you earlier, in that we were solicited by an editor who said, do you have any contemporary Ukrainian poetry that you're working on? We said, absolutely. We've got poems by Yuri Andruchovich, and we sent them. This editor said, well, these are great poems, but we're really not interested. We're looking more for something about the war. Okay, as if it were documentary, and this was missing the mark. But generally speaking, other editors and readers seem to want to read Yuri Androkovich's poems in English right now. Okay, and in that case, we work really closely with Androkovich himself. He has, even through the war, the intensification of the war, he has responded to our emails. He has looked over poems before we send them to an editor, and he has given us many suggestions. Mostly all of them have been implemented, and that's where we are now.
Thank you so much for being on the program. It's great talking to you both and hearing about what Serhiy Zhadan is doing now, and about this really wonderful collection that you've put together.
Thank you very much, David. It was great to be here.
Thank you, David, for having us.
Remember, I said to hang on. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications about new videos from the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Go to the Polish Cultural Institute's website, linked in the description down below, to see a full schedule of upcoming episodes. Stay tuned for the credits for some recommendations about how you can support humanitarian aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. Our sponsor, the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, is directed by Robert Czaniawski. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, suggested this series and is our executive producer. My fellow producer, Natalia Iudin, handles all the video editing, technical and aesthetic aspects of this production. Claudia Ofłona-Draber, head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, keeps us all informed about upcoming episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature and other events organized by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month, when we'll be returning to a topic that we postponed back in April. 20th century poet and memoirist Aleksander Wat, with Professor Michał Paweł Markowski, one of Poland's most productive literary theorists, and Stefan and Lucy Haynot Family Chair in Polish Language and Literature at the University of Illinois at Chicago. See you then.